A huge thank you to Robert Bishop for sponsoring today's video on Patreon. Another deck tech coming to you via Moxfield. This time we are looking at Bello, Bard of the Brambles.
Good morning, next enforcement, how may I help?
Hello?
Hello there.
Hello. Bloomburrow bungalows?
Sorry?
A 3/3 for 3 mana in Gruul. During your turn, each non-equipment artifact and non-aura enchantment you control with mana value 4 or greater is a 4/4 elemental creature with indestructible and haste, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So in this deck we want to get down decent sized artifacts and enchantments and then buff them up with various effects, get double strike on them and things like that. Let's get straight through to the creature section. We're starting with apparently Dockside Extortionist. Don't forget that the artifacts do have to be CMC 4 or greater, so we're not going to cheat in a bunch of creatures with this, but it's a very good mana accelerant. Elvish Archivist I have never played before, but it does trigger on both artifacts for plus counters and enchantments for a card draw, so it's an enchantress and an artifacts rus. Sakura Tribelder for land-based ramp and can block some big creatures that might swing in towards us. Outcaster Trailblazer cares about power 4 or greater. Now, when this is in play and whenever we play an artifact or an enchantment, it is going to enter as a 4/4 as long as our commander's with us, and it will trigger the Outcaster Trailblazer for a card draw. Wood Elves is just yet more land ramp. I have put some creatures in here, creature-based ramp like this, so that we've got some means of chump blocking, because once it is not our turn anymore, Bello is not going to see the artifacts and enchantments as creatures. So we are going to be pretty wide open, and the more chump blockers such as a Wood Elves we can get in play, the longer that we will be able to carry on playing in the game without suffering from an alpha strike from somebody. Nihileo, God of the Hunt, is a 6/6 indestructible when it has devotion of 5 to green, and there's every chance that we could get into that. Otherwise it's just a 4/4 indestructible creature thanks to the Bello's ability, and this one gives trample, so we want to get the buffs on the enchantments and the artifacts like I said, and not much point in buffing them up really big if they don't have trample, because otherwise they can be chump blocked all day. Solemn Simulacrum, interesting in this list. It's another creature based land ramp. It stays a creature when it is not our turn, but it does enter as a 4/4 with Bello. Xenagos, God of Revels, similar to the previous god, this one enables a buff to power and toughness as well as haste, and it's always going to be at least a 4/4 indestructible. Not sure how likely it is that we get devotion of 7 with this. We are looking to get a lot of permanents into play, so I suppose there's every chance that we can use this as an indestructible blocker, so that we don't have to worry as much about the swing back like I mentioned previously. And then we're in green, so we're focused on land-based ramp, Farseek, Nature's Law, all the typical culprits here. Jeska's Will, I suppose you could count it as ramp. It's more of a card advantage spell in my mind. Pretty typical that you're going to have at least one opponent that has a decent number of cards in hand, so should hopefully be able to cherry pick the best cards off the top 3 of your library. And then Wheel of Fortune, going to refill your hand. You have to be careful when you cast this, but like I said, there's often a player that has a decent number of cards in hand, and at the end of the day, if you need to push the win through, then refilling your opponent's hands when they don't have many cards available to them is just a risk you have to take sometimes. Chain Reaction, we want to get big power and toughness on our artifacts and enchantment creatures. So if we can get indestructible on our commander as well, then it means that we can wrath the board with something like Ashandra's Ignition. The difficulty will be keeping the commander in play, because this is one of those decks that is very, very heavily reliant on the commander, so hopefully it will not be dealt with. Maybe we don't even have Bello in play. We could go for a Chain Reaction, a Blasphemous Act, something like that, and then throw Bello into play afterwards. And the artifacts and enchantments we assume we're in since the previous turn, so they don't have Summoning Sickness anymore. They can swing in straight away after said board wipe. Skyshroud Claim, more land-based ramp. Chandra's Ignition, at the very least, it's probably going to be able to be pointed at a 4/4 creature, so it can deal 4 damage to every other creature in play. Unfortunately, this will take down Bello. Maybe we could point this at Bello and just do 3 damage to everything, although I should really have looked over the list before I started recording this. I'm sure I've put in a means of protecting our commander. Yeah, there's a Darksteel Plate. Got the Mithril Coat as well. And an argument to be made for putting the Hammer of Nazan in here. Perhaps some means of pro-red as well. Maybe we could put a Chroma's Memorial in here because that's a big artifact. And that will give us protection from red as well so that we can't have damage dealt to us with our own board wipes. So yeah, already some potential improvements to be made in the deck, but we do want to definitely keep our commander in play. So yeah, these Wraths are something that we're going to have to try and dodge via Indestructible or protection from red, I think. Rishkar's Expertise, again, big power, so lots of draw. And the artifacts and enchantments do want to be north of 4 CMC, so getting a free 5 CMC spell like that into play is going to be particularly useful. Blasphemous Act, we've already been over multiple red board wipes here. A Bite Down with the big power that's in play. It's useful to be able to direct that power towards a problematic creature, or we could have it directly onto a Planeswalker as well, which saves our attacks. Because we can get double strike on these creatures and don't necessarily want to waste double strike on a Planeswalker. Heroic Intervention protects the board, we all know about that. We all know about Beast Within and Chaos Warp. Entish Restoration doesn't necessarily go in every deck, but the fact that we've got consistent 4 power creatures means that we can go and grab 3 lands out of our deck with the Entish Restoration, so well worth an include, and bear in mind it's an instant as well, so you don't have to show your opponents this card. Hunter's Insight, not much point in creating big heavy hitters if you're not going to swing in. So Hunter's Insight, we're going to draw at least 4 cards with this thing. Mana Crypt goes in most decks along with Sol Ring on Magic Online. We've got the Mana Vault in here because we do care about particularly big permanents that we're getting into play, and that does mean that the mana curve is higher than it would be normally. So we need to try and keep up with our opponents on mana before they completely outpace us with their lower curve decks. Lightning Greaves, we already have haste on our creatures as long as the Bard is in play, but Lightning Greaves will help protect our commander from any spot removal. That's the reason this is in here, don't necessarily care about the haste on our commander. Same reason the Swiftfoot Boots is in here, just a means of protection. And we've already been over the Darksteel Plate and the Mithril Coat. Like I said, argument to be made for Hammer of Nazan as well, just really want to protect the commander from any board wipes or destruction magic. Thran Dynamo can either use it as a 4/4 creature, or we can tap it down for mana straight away. We're getting into the first examples of the artifacts that are big enough to become the 4/4s. Vedalken Orrery gives us flash on our spells and makes it much more difficult for our opponents to play around us. We don't want to allow our opponents to be reactionary towards us if we can help it. Gilded Lotus, just like the Thran Dynamo, except this makes some coloured mana. A lot of people don't like Gilded Lotus because it's expensive, but worst case scenario we can just dump it down as a 4/4. Chimil, or however you say it, Chimil, the Inner Sun, means that our spells can't be countered and we get to discover 5 at the end of the turn, so definitely going to be able to get some decent free spells out of this. And I'm not sure how many permanents we would get down that we could make use of straight away during the end step. Maybe that's something to keep an eye out for the rest of the deck tech, but pretty much in here just to make us uncounterable and to get the free spells out as well. Obelisk of Erd, all of our creatures are going to be elementals, or at least the artifacts and the enchantments are anyway. So instead of the elementals being mere 4/4s, they will be 6/6s instead, and should be plenty of artifacts and enchantments in play enough to pay the convoke cost on this. We're not going to be particularly bothered about a load of our artifacts and enchantments being tapped during our opponent's turns because they won't be creatures anymore anyway. Spine of Ishsar, a 7/7 that enters and destroys any permanent, and then if it is blown up at some point it will return to hand ready for us to cast it again and continue to abuse our opponent's permanents. Not as likely that it's going to die in combat because it is going to be indestructible, but I don't know, maybe there'll be an edict effect or something and we can play into that. Something like a Sheoldred on our opponent's side of the field, we can sacrifice this simply so that we can replay it. And speaking of sacrificing, Portal to Phyrexia enters and our opponents each sacrifice 3 creatures, so it's kind of like a one-sided board wipe, which we were kind of referring to before. We'll be able to clear out some of our opponent's creatures, oftentimes completely clear the way, ready for attacks, and then we'll get some incremental advantage from Portal to Phyrexia as well by reanimating creatures from any graveyard, and at the very worst we can just use those as further chump blockers because, Like we said previously, we're not going to have many creatures in play during our opponent's turns, which could be an issue for us. The Great Henge going to trigger on the artifacts and enchantments entering into it, so they will get a plus counter from this, as well as draw as a card. They will count as non-token creatures when they enter, and just like the other mana rocks that we've got, the big mana rocks, we can always tap this for mana if we are desperate at all. Onto the enchantments, we're starting in ascending order, so Sylvan Library not going to ever be a creature, but it is good enough to fix our draws and can even put extra life into it to draw more cards. We all know about Sylvan Library by now. Elemental Bond triggers on our artifacts and enchantments entering as creatures, so we'll draw as a card whenever we do that. Same is true of the Garruk's Uprising, and this is another means of giving them trample as well. So just like Nylea, we have a means of pushing through the extra damage. Greater Good, so with this we have a means of drawing 4 cards and discarding 3, assuming that we only have 4/4 creatures in play. Not likely that we're going to be able to respond to a board wipe with this, because the artifacts and enchantments are not creatures during our opponent's turns, and your opponent is typically going to cast a Wrath on his turn. But maybe you can respond to a Rift or something like that. This goes well with the Spine of Ishtar I was mentioning previously, so we can draw 4 from that, discard the 3, get Spine of Ishtar straight back into hand. Or maybe we just have no cards in hand whatsoever and we're desperate to get into a specific card. We can sacrifice creatures until hopefully we get into them. This will dig us really, really deep into our deck. Gruul War Chant, always have to read this one because never played it outside this deck. Attacking creatures you control get +1 to power and have menace. I'm glad that they've retconned all that text into menace now. So once again, pushing more damage through, but giving us evasion so that we can get more damage through as well. Molten Echoes, don't have too many means of making copies in this deck. We do have a few legendary permanents, but plenty to make copies with as well. This one cares about a creature type, so we're going to be choosing Elemental with this, of course. And we don't have to pay for this, which is why I decided to include it. I don't particularly like the idea of playing a decent sized spell like this and then having to pay further mana to make it actually relevant. So whenever a non-token creature of the chosen type, Elemental, enters under your control, create a token copy of it. It gains haste and you exile it at the end step. So argument to be made for that going well with the Greater Good we just looked at. We can sacrifice the token before it gets exiled and might as well take some free card advantage from it. A Nature's Will, another one that we don't see very much of in any format as far as I can tell, certainly not Commander. Whenever one or more creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, tap the lands they control and untap the lands you control. So if we can push damage through to all 3 of our opponents, we are going to free the way during our second main phase to tap down all their lands so that they can't disrupt us during our turn, and obviously we get even more mana. So if we were able to tap down all of our mana during the first main and then untap during the second, that would be absolutely ideal. And like I said, we're switching off our opponent's mana, so even less likely that they're going to mess with us. Outpost Siege, a means of card advantage. I don't think we're going to be worried about the Dragons version of this. Whenever a creature leaves the battlefield under your control, 1 damage to any target. No, don't care about that. We're going to be choosing Khans, which is exile the top card of your library at the upkeep and you can play it. Not the best card advantage spell, but it's kind of like a red Phyrexian Arena, and worst case scenario, as we can always say in this deck, it's a 4/4 creature with haste and indestructible for 4 mana. Stimulus Package, another 4 mana spell. Kept the curve as low as I could because not much sense in littering the deck with a bunch of 7 mana permanents. We want to get as many of these big creatures into play as possible. So when this one enters the battlefield, we get a couple of untapped treasure tokens. So this effectively only costs 2 mana if you look at it like that. And then we can sacrifice a treasure in order to make citizen tokens. I wouldn't have thought we'd be bothering doing that, but if we are worried about the swing back from any of the big creatures, then we could just play this for 4 mana. It enters as a 4/4 on our turn, and also enters with a couple of 1/1 tokens. Vernal Bloom, I need to double check that the Yavimaya land isn't in here actually, because we don't want to make our opponent's lands into forests, because this is a world ability that taps forests for an additional mana. So basically we want it so that every time we tap a forest for mana, we get an additional green. But if Yavimaya Cradle of Growth is in play, it does affect all of our opponent's lands as well, doubling up all their lands as well. So obviously want to avoid that. I'll have to remember to check the lands. Whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, tap all lands that player controls. It is noteworthy that it's only opponents that this affects. A lot of these red enchantments that affect lands and do mana burn and all that type of thing do tend to affect you as well, but this is one of the rare instances in which it only affects your opponents. If a creature an opponent controls attacks, all creatures that the opponent controls attack as well. A perfect spell for us in which we are encouraging our opponents to not hold back any creatures and not hold back any mana either. We don't want mana during our opponent's turns hanging over our heads. It's more likely with this that our opponents are going to swing in all out, and if that's the case then that pans out perfectly well for us because we want to be attacking with all of our big creatures anyway. Asceticism, I had to double check the wording on this. It is creatures you control have hexproof, and the asceticism is going to be a creature along with all of our other enchantments and artifacts. So they will have hexproof as well as the indestructible and haste during our turn. And again during our turn we can pay 2 mana to regenerate a target creature. In rare instances with something like a Shadow Spear, might be able to remove indestructible from our creatures and then blow something up. Wouldn't have thought that the regenerate would be all that handy. Maybe could keep our commander in play with it though. Berserker's Onslaught, there is a 6 mana version of this. I think it's Wound Reflection is the black one. Anyway, there's a red one from the Reflection cycle, 6 mana. Your creatures have double strike. Not much point in giving our creatures double strike if they're not creatures during our opponent's turn. All we really care about is our attacking creatures having double strike, and if we can pay 1 less mana to get such an effect, then that's what we'll do. So Berserker's Onslaught going to save us a mana and give us the relevant effect of only attacking creatures having double strike. Glorious Sunrise gives us another Anthem effect, so we can choose from 4 of the effects at the beginning of combat. We can only choose one of them, and I'm thinking it's likely going to be creatures we control get +1/+1, and once again it is a trample enabler. Can go for giving a land some extra mana in case we are desperate to get another play going, and we can gain 3 life as well, not likely to choose that one. Draw a card if you control a creature with power 3 or greater. With our commander in play we'll have a 3 power creature, and this will be a 4/4, so we can definitely meet that requirement. As I said, this is an Anthem effect with trample though, as far as I'm concerned. Gratuitous Violence, a means of doubling damage. If a creature you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double damage instead. Interesting that this is going to be a creature and it will double its own damage, so if we can get double strike and a Gratuitous Violence into play, then we're going to be getting a lot of damage thrown around on our turn. Sight of the Scale Lords, at the beginning of combat on our turn, our creatures with toughness 4 or greater, which is all of them, +2/+2 and vigilance until the end of the turn. Wouldn't have thought vigilance is going to be all that important apart from the Convoke spell that we saw previously that cares about elementals getting +2/+2. But apart from that, having our big enchantments and artifacts be tapped during our opponent's turn isn't really of much relevance to us. This is obviously in here for the +2/+2 buff, meaning that we can swing in with 6/6s. And if we can get them up to 6/6s, then Unnatural Growth will double up the power and toughness to 12/12s. Noteworthy that this triggers on every single combat, including your opponent's, but not going to be all that relevant during your opponent's turns, as Bello only cares about our turn. But I suppose we can treat this as a bit of a Gruul aggro deck, so we want to be getting the power and toughness up on our creatures as fast as we can and turning in sideways with that haste. And another means of pushing through a lot of damage is Fire Emancipation, tripling the damage of sources we control towards permanents or players. And the great thing about this deck is that we've got Indestructible on our creatures as well as haste, so we can play a card like this and then just swing in with it immediately. And it doesn't really matter if our opponent blocks or not. We're likely going to kill off anything they block with, and anything they don't, we're dealing massive amounts of damage in this instance. So this being a 4/4 and swinging in would deal 12 damage as opposed to 4, and then if you get buffs and double strike and trample on it, then you're really going to give your opponents a headache. Mana Reflection, talked about the Reflection cycle previously. We gain twice as much mana from the permanents that we tap down. Pretty simple one, we've seen it plenty on the channel. Wallstorm Surge, interestingly, triggers itself when it enters now, so Whenever a creature enters under your control, deal damage equal to its power to any target. We're assuming that that is going to be 4 power most of the time, but like we've said a few times, any anthem effects mean that we can throw damage directly at our opponent's faces, I'm hoping, because we want to be able to swing in and deal massive amounts of damage to them, point damage from a Warstorm Surge at them as fast as possible, and knock players out pretty quickly. City on Fire, another Convoke spell, so that Vigilance from the previous enchantment might be more useful than I'm thinking, although you'd think you'd want to play this before combat. If a source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals triple damage instead, just like the Fiery Emancipation, except this one has the chance of being a little bit cheaper. Might play the Convoke spell, might not. I suppose it depends on what we're willing to swing in with, although I imagine we just turn everything in sideways in this deck. Not worried about losing things with Indestructible. Onto the mana base here. I don't think it's anything all that incredible, to be honest. We've got typical fetch lands and dual lands and stuff like that. Boseiju can be a means of removal for us. But yeah, apart from that, it's typical duels, the surveil lands we need to remember to include from now on. Demolition Field, a means of blowing up lands. Problem lands like Gaia's Cradles, Cabal Coffers, Nykthos, things like that. Didn't really like Field of Ruin because it gives your opponent's lands, but Demolition Field is the fixed version of that. 1 land for you, 1 land for the opponent whose land you just blew up. Basic count might be a little bit low on this list, so yeah, I need to keep an eye on that. We always want to be able to fetch a basic out with this. Did decide to include Field of the Dead because I am concerned with the lack of creatures that we have on our side of the field during our opponent's turns. Mentioned it a few times, we want to be able to chump block and save ourselves a decent amount of damage until our next turn comes around and we can start handing out damage ourselves. Mixed up the basics, so there are forests and snow forests, same with the mountains. Gaia's Cradle, I'm assuming that we're going to have a decent number of creatures in play, even if this only generates 2 or 3 mana, that's perfectly alright, and with a Field of the Dead in play, I hope that it would generate even more. Yeah, a Pain Land. Kessig Wolf Run is going to push even more damage through for us, and is yet another trample enabler. Mosswort Bridge also, I think we need power of 10, so a couple of 4/4s and our commander is going to have it so that we can get a free spell out with this. I've started steering away from playing Mosswort Bridge simply because I do have a real aversion to tap lands. If I'm going to play a tap land, it does have to be of high relevance and great utility for us. But the fact that we've got some really expensive spells in the deck means that being able to cheat them out with an effect like this is worth taking the turn off on an extra mana, I think. Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, another means of generating multiple amounts of mana on a single land. Plaza of Heroes, a means of giving indestructible and hexproof to our commander, because, as we've said before, it is imperative that we keep Bello in play. Rootbound Crag, yeah, more fetches. Okay, Shifting Woodland is an impressive one. For only 4 mana, you can have it become a copy of a permanent in your graveyard until the end of the turn. So maybe we've had a double strike enabler, a triple damage enabler blown up or something like that on an opponent's turn, and we want to be able to bring that back and make it so that we can push lethal damage through, something like that. I'm sure there's countless scenarios that we can make use of with a Shifting Woodland. I do have high hopes for this land. Skarg the Rage Pits, yet another means of trample. Feel like a broken record with the trample. Yeah, we've got the... I have not put the full art version in here, which is, yeah, mixing up the basics like that. Infuriating. Gonna have to fix that with the utmost haste. Alright, there's another interesting one. I didn't think that the mana base was all this interesting, but apparently it is. Mycosynth Gardens, I've put in a few decks and haven't been able to use yet since it was released. Becomes a copy of a non-token artifact you control with mana value X. So say you copy something for 4 mana, it will indefinitely, you'll lose a land, but it will indefinitely stay as a copy of that thing. So are there any other lands that we want to look at before we get sidetracked? No, just more fetches. So over to the artifacts. It could be not much point in making another Vidalcan Orrery. Obelisk of Erd. It cost a decent amount of mana, but could be another buff from the Obelisk of Erd. Yeah, Legendary Great Henge. Portal to Phyrexia means that we reanimate more stuff. That be too much mana to bother with, I imagine. Chimil's Legendary. Copying Mana Rocks is pretty boring, not much point in going forward Orrery unless we want 2 of them in play. Suppose we could make an emergency copy of a Mithril Coat or a Darksteel Plate, Lightning Greaves, Mana Rock or something like that, but yeah, when I added it to the deck maybe I was thinking it was going to be of more use than maybe it actually will be, so I'm not sure that outside of Sol Rings and Swiftfoot Boots and things like that, the Mycosynth Gardens is going to be worth sacrificing to turn into anything. I'll leave it in the deck and see how it performs because I haven't been able to play with it yet. And the eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed that there's 101 cards in the list. I did decide to throw in the Akroma's Memorial. Now actually, while I remember, there was the Hammer of Nazan, and there was also, I thought of maybe the One Ring as well, could be handy. I need to double check in the list and make sure that we've got enough means of card draw, but the One Ring might be a bit risky because we don't have that much means of life gain, but if we feel as though we can win really quickly, as I'm hoping we will be able to in this list, then maybe the One Ring is going to be worth including. Just because I can't be bothered to find what cards to cut for that, I'll leave it out for now, but that's worth considering. So then it's finding a spot for the Akroma's Memorial. I'm remiss to get rid of Portal to Phyrexia, but do we care that much about slowly reanimating other creatures? It is good as a sort of one-sided board wipe. I do think we're going to get more use out of the protection from red on the Akroma's Memorial though, because we do have those red wraths and we want to be able to use them with Bello in play. So I'll try Akroma's Memorial over the Portal to Phyrexia for now. And then do we want Hammer of Nazan? I think we do. Noteworthy that this will not become a creature because it is an equipment, even though it's 4 CMC. But what would we cut for it is the question. We've got 16 artifacts and 21 enchantments, so is there any 4 CMC enchantments we feel as though we might want to give up on? Maybe Outpost Siege could get traded out for that One Ring, because it is a lot slower than the One Ring is. Although, as I was saying before, if we're tapping down the One Ring for card draw, then it's not much use to us as a creature, is it? We're not swinging in with it, so I don't know, just kind of thinking as I go here. You can let me know in the comment section what you think, just for the sake of not messing around for too long on the video. I'll leave out the Hammer of Nazan for now. Can always make cuts after the first game or two, so let's go through to the playtesting and see how we feel as though the deck is going to perform. Alright, so first up we've got Entish Restoration on turn 2 off the back of an Ancient Tomb. We'd only get an additional land from that, so yeah, we're too reliant on top deck mode there. I think we're not looking at any artifacts or enchantments that we can get into. Alright, well we've got a little bit of everything we want there, so let's try this one. Draw a card on turn 1 is the Outcaster Trailblazer, which arguably we want to get in before the Nature's Will so that it can trigger the card draw. So let's just try a land for now. We might have to use the Mana Vault in order to go for the Kodama's Reach. Turn 2 takes us into a land. I need to sort out the land art on this deck. But yeah, now that we've got 3 lands, I won't waste the Mana Vault. Let's go for the Enchantress here that cares about artifacts and enchantments. Takes us through to turn 2, and there's another land that could become a copy of the... Do we have to tap it to make it a copy of Mana Vault? Yes, we do, so not a very good copy of Mana Vault because we just have to pay for it. Play the Kodama's Reach. We'll take the mana while we can in the early game because this is a mana-hungry deck. That can be a mountain and a snow mountain. Like I said before, we are quite light on the number of basics and we only have 1 snow-covered mountain in the deck, so it might be worth pulling it out of there sooner than later before it gets milled or something. So then we are round to turn 4. We've accelerated a little bit on mana. Draw into the Garruk's Uprising, so we could get Garruk's Uprising into play over the Trailblazer because it's not as susceptible to a board wipe. And we could go for Mana Vault. That would leave us with 4, 5, 6, 7 mana so that we could get both our commander and the Garruk's Uprising down. And that would set us up nicely for next turn, so yeah, I think we do that. Yeah, so get Bello into play, get the Garruk's Uprising into play, draw a card from the Enchantress there. It would also get a couple of plus counters thanks to the Mana Vault entering. So this is now a more effective blocker. And we're through to our next turn. Hopefully can start getting down some enchantments here. Draw into Soul Rings, so start keeping better track of the mana now. Soul Ring. And we drew into War's Toll. So we've got access to 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 mana, which means we could go for the Trailblazer and play the Nature's Will. Now in a proper game of Commander I would probably hold up the Mithril Coat because we've already mentioned how important that is. Just for the sake of looking at more cards here and for the fun of it, we'll pay the Nature's Will. I suppose if we feel as though we can get through, we can untap all of these lands, and then we will be able to continue to cast more spells. So that is the first enchantment. So we draw from the Enchantress, draw from the Outcast, draw from the Garruk's Uprising. It is a 4/4 creature. So it's turn 5, we've got a 4/4 trample. Let's assume that we can get through for trample damage on at least one opponent. That will untap our lands for the turn. And then we've drawn into Dockside Extortionist. Wouldn't have thought we'd make too much treasure out of that, so we'll just keep hold of it. Could go for the Jeska's Will because we've got a red spell in hand, so worst case scenario we just get to cast that. Go for the Jeska's Will. Turn 5, shall we just say that we make 5 red mana from that. So tap down those 3 lands, we get 3 cards exiled, so keep those over there. 5 mana in the mana pool plus 6, 7 and 8 in total. So what do we do here? We can go for a Chandra's Ignition if we feel as though we needed to. We decided not to go for the Indestructible onto the Mithril Coat though, although we could still do it if we needed to. While we're running low on cards, let's just go for the Outpost Siege. And for the, I suppose we could wait until we draw first, so already drawn on the Archivist, but we will draw again from our 4 power Matters cards. So I think we said we have 8 mana in total, didn't we? So that means that we've got 4 mana left available. Let's just go for the War's Toll here and draw a couple more cards. So I managed to dig in and get our second land that we needed in hand, and we've got plenty of mana available to us here. So once again with this kind of board state we have risked not having the Mithril Coat, but we could always play in a different manner depending on the board state we're up against. We have to just kind of do a bit of guesswork of the type of thing that we would be up against in a game like this. Obviously every game of Commander is different and it's only us at the board at the moment. Take one more turn just for the hell of it. Draw into a Nature's Law. We've got the, what is that? The Ancient Tomb for 2 mana being tapped. This is still tapped. Alright, so we're actually a bit shy on green mana here. I was just looking at playing the Mana Reflections, so we could go for the Nature's Law. So tap down, go and grab a forest. Where are we? Just grab any forest. I'm not usually that strict with what I grab here because it's just a pretend game. Obviously we'd probably make that a tiger or something, wouldn't we? Then we could go for Wood Elves as well to grab ourselves another forest. Let's just take the Rootbound Crag, just pretending it's a tiger because I can't be bothered looking for it. So then we have 2, 4, 5, 6 and 7 mana available after that. So do we play ourselves a Rishkar's Expertise and see what free spell we can get into here? What's the power? It's going to be 4 at the moment. So let's draw 4 cards. Clearing lands off the top, there's that Akroma's Memorial. So the free spell in this instance would either be a Dockside Extortionist in order to continue to play some more expensive spells, or it would be the Mithril Coat, so just throw that on our commander. Anyway, I think you get the gist here. We've still got the chance to untap all of our stuff and get down the Mana Reflection now with additional green mana, so that we can continue to play cards now with double mana. So we'll probably get down the Akroma's Memorial this turn as well. Obviously it all depends on what our opponents are playing here. We didn't exile a card with the Outpost Siege either, so there we go. We might have access to an Elemental Bond as well that turn. But you get the gist. That is Bello, Bard of the Brambles. I hope you enjoyed the deck tech and look forward to gameplay with this commander. I'm not sure which ones, I'm never sure which ones are popular from the recent sets, so I just tend to build the ones that I think are the most fun. So hopefully we're on the same wavelength there. Big thank you to the patrons for their support of the channel financially. You can do so yourself via the link in the description below. There's a link for the debt list in the description as well. I'm tribalkai. Thank you for watching.